Welcome back to the Metropolitan Culture Corner. Last month, we traveled the world with journalist Alicia Escribano, and this month we explore something of our inner world with professor and researcher Francisco José Eiroa-Orosa. He completed a European doctorate in Clinical Psychology and Psychiatry at the Universities of Hamburg and the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. After stays in Dresden and Montevideo, Francisco José held teaching positions at the Universities of Edinburgh and East London, as well as fellowships at Yale University in the US and at the Universitat de Barcelona. Currently, he is an associate professor of psychological treatment and also collaborates with the Spanish Association of Mental Health Professionals, the European Network for Ex-Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, as well as the Global Anti-Stigma. Now, while these interviews on the Metropolitan Culture Corner often focus on people from the world of the arts, our mental health, both as individuals and as members of the wider community, within the arts and outside of them. And it's an aspect that was, at least until recently, extremely taboo. But thanks to the work of people like Francisco José and his colleagues, people are getting more and more comfortable, more and more used to the idea of discussing mental health as a critical component of our overall health and well-being, as well as the overall health of our community, of our society, as well as having a better understanding of the connection between the two. So please welcome Francisco José Eiroa-Orosa to the Metropolitan Culture Corner. Thank you very much for being here. I wanted to start at the beginning and ask you what drew you to the field of psychology in the first place?
Well, that's a good question. I had experiences of personal distress, and I also was curious. And I also had not enough marks to go to nursing. I wanted to study psychology, but in those times nursing was only 3 years, and that would allow me to have a job and then study psychology while being a nurse. I was planning to be a mental health nurse for a time and then switch to psychotherapy. That was the plan, and I almost did it, but just 0.1, and I ended up doing directly psychology. My grade in the exam after high school, like it was 6.4, I had 6.3. It was enough for psychology, not enough for nursing.
Okay.
But I didn't want to go into mental health. I just wanted to have a job quicker. And being a nurse is super quick. It was 3 years, and the day you finish, you have a job.
I know you're familiar with the American education system as well as the education system here. Could you explain just really briefly the difference between how those two systems work when it comes to getting your doctorate? Because a lot of our readers or our viewers are in the United States and they don't understand that there's a difference in the systems.
Well, for example, in the US, you have a system that is really clear of clinical PhDs. It will be strange that someone like me, an associate professor and full professor to be in clinical psychology, psychological treatment, would not have a clinical PhD. I do have a research PhD. I do have clinical training, but that doesn't allow me to practice in the NHS, in the Spanish National Health System. In the US, most people doing clinical psychology do clinical PhDs. In a clinical PhD, you have training plus research. The research is less intense and is usually done outside of the universities, or in some cases like in institutes that depend on universities but are like outside. So here you can do clinical training or a PhD. In the US, there are PhDs that are both things at the same time.
Whether studying or working, you've been obviously here in Barcelona, but also in Germany, you've been in Scotland, you've been in England, you've been in the US. How has studying and working, not only in different institutions around the world, but also in different cultures, different countries, different urban environments, how's that informed your work and your perspective on your work?
Well, that has informed my work in the sense that I explain sometimes different systems of clinical psychology, psychotherapy, and I really know them. I was there. And I was trained by and with people that were going through that system. And I also know the difference in the daily life. You know, for example, in Germany, they do have something that is what we would call here private. But in Germany, as they have this public-private insurance system, you go to those private places with your health card. While here, you go to a private place, like the office of a psychotherapist, or you go to the public system, which is usually in a building where there are other types of doctors and, you know, typical Spanish national health system. That makes it really different. Also, in Germany, you can, without being in a very difficult situation, you can have weekly appointments. Well, here, that only happens if you're going through the most distressful situation in your life. So that makes things really different when it comes to training, to the experience of professionals, experience of service users. It's completely different. In the UK, they have something more similar to here, but not really. They are public public mental health services and clinics, but there is also an environment of mixed places, more what we call here private, but you can access without paying, or at least with some kind of reduction. And the US is quite complicated, I would say. It's complicated because it's different in different states, because there are many different systems. Most people do psychotherapy in private places, but you also have the veteran system that is like a healthcare system in itself. And there is so many people in the US that has been enrolled in the army that is a system, we don't have here for our military. Thousands of people, thousands of professionals, and hundreds of thousands of service users. And sometimes they give services to people that has not been in the army, but maybe they are relatives, or even, it's super complicated. And making comparisons is not so easy.
Do you find that the different systems impact people's willingness to seek help if they feel like they need it?
Yeah, probably, but I wouldn't say that there is a country or a system that is better than the other. All have advantages and disadvantages. They all have pluses and minuses.
In your research and your work specifically, you focus mostly on people who struggle with addiction, is that right?
That was my PhD, but I don't do it anymore.
Well, at the time when you were researching that, what made you interested in investigating further? The topic of mental health in Spain in general has been a taboo for a long time. I don't know if addiction and mental health was more taboo, or if it was something that you were exploring for personal reasons.
I started to do that in Germany, not in Spain. I went to Germany to do my PhD to Hamburg. I was working more in the mental health consequences of torture and political violence, but that didn't go with a lot of money, so I needed a job. And I had this opportunity from the European Commission to do an internship in Germany. It was a clinical internship, but they also offered me to do some research. At the beginning, I was also working in the same field, mental health, consequences of being a refugee, political violence, and so on. But then one of my bosses was the head of service of addictions, and he said, "Do you want to join us?" And they had this massive project, like thousands of service users, that made heroin legal in Germany. And they needed people to do secondary analysis of a massive database. They had already published like the main study, which was the study that made possible to legalize heroin treatment. You cannot consume, but you can be treated with heroin in Germany and in some other countries.
So under doctor's supervision, they administer doses of heroin to eventually wean people off of it.
Yeah.
So there's more funding from the European Commission and in terms of these national infrastructures in general for psychology that has to do with recovery from addiction than for torture and post-traumatic stress?
Not really. It depends what is problematic in each stage. So, for example, when the war in Ukraine started, there was a lot of money for political violence and refugees. When I started my PhD in 2008, Germany had a problem with heroin. The government of Germany commissioned this research center to do that study.
That makes sense.
So it depends on the context of what's going on the interests of each country, because I guess now there is funding for fentanyl in the US, for the treatment and prevention of fentanyl addiction in the US, because you have a problem with that.
So do you find that in the way that psychology has evolved in Europe, in wherever territory we're talking about, do you find that the evolution has to do with policy and legislation as much as it does the medical community's interest in how they feel like it should advance?
Politics are always there. I used to read a guy who is called Nicholas Rose. He's a post-Foucauldian, so he's like a follower of Foucault's ideas. And he proves very clearly that politics are always there. For example, the first MSc programs in the UK, a lot of power also in clinical psychology in the US after the Second World War, was given to psychologists that were helping the military during the war. Not because they were the best, but because they were willing to help with that. I mean, everyone in the UK and the US was at war against an external enemy. But it is true that the psychologists collaborated in things that were a little bit tricky, like helping with torturing methods, things like that. Or helping lying to people, like they helped designing campaigns to lie to German people so they thought the war was going in a different direction, that was designed by psychologists, deceiving people more than lying to people. And those psychologists were given a lot of power in these clinical programs. So they shaped what clinical psychology is today in Anglo-Saxon countries, and Anglo-Saxon countries have shaped how is clinical psychology in the whole world. But also, apart from these specific moments of history where you have to thank someone for something very important, we are dependent on many industries. I mean, psychiatry is dependent on the pharma industry, psychology is dependent on our industries like the book industry, but also psychotherapy industry and now well-being, happiness industry will depend on the market. We live in capitalist countries, so there are different markets and they have really different interests. And these interests are sometimes contradictory. For example, in the US, a tension that is very clear is between the pharma industry and the insurance industry. Pharma industry wants to sell more drugs. The insurance industry doesn't want to pay for more drugs. So there is like a tension. It's not always in the same direction. Sometimes there are industries that have conflicting interests.
As professionals in the middle of this complicated spider's web, so to speak, of conflicting interests, government policy, ethics, how is it possible to then pursue, as the medical professionals who understand the roots of all of this, how is it possible to pursue the kinds of research that you guys want to do or that you feel is important?
That's a good question. I mean, there is people now, especially now from 2010, 2015, that is really attacking, criticizing the very foundations of clinical psychology and psychiatry. There is a lot of internal critique saying that we don't heal people or we don't even help people, that we just adapt people to the capitalist society so they can continue to be productive. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree partly with that, but I also know that if you don't help people with some issues, even if they then go to a demonstration or they join an activist group, they have some ways of functioning that it's the same in a job or in an activist group or in the Communist Party. You're going to have these problems because you don't relate well to others. And mostly in any type of psychotherapy, we work a lot with relationships. And there is a lot of people today that have problems relating with others, relating with themselves also. And that's help that people need regardless of then what they do with their lives. But it is also true that for a long time, we have been focused on making people functional so they can go back to work or they can continue to work. Sometimes we are making people able to go through things that are unjust without telling them to be assertive with those injustices. So yeah, there are things to think about, but I wouldn't subscribe this very radical view that we just help people adapt to an unjust society.
So do you feel that in that sense, let's say within the past 10 years or so, do you feel like the perspective of the community of psychiatrists and psychologists, if the perspective has changed in that regard as to the goals of treatment?
It's not only the goals of treatment, it's where we are. I mean, if you think about a psychiatrist, as a clinical psychologist, you think about a closed room with a table, 2 chairs, maybe family therapy with more chairs.
You gotta include the sofa. That's like part of the cliche.
Sofa for divan, we call it in Spanish. I don't remember how it's in English. But yeah, the typical sofa where you...
Right.
But you don't think about community spaces. You don't think about interventions in places where people is with other people. You just think about that closed space. And maybe we have to think about clinical psychology, psychiatry, mental health professionals going out there and doing interventions outside the clinic, outside those closed spaces. In fact, I was reading this summer a book which is called Trauma and Movement in Clinical Psychology Outside the Clinic. So it's sounding more and more and more. And the publisher is a famous publisher, you know, it's not like super underground or outsider. No, it's Palgrave Macmillan. All these publishers are starting to publish things that go a little bit against the mainstream, or not so a little bit, quite a lot against the mainstream.
So would you say that these days there's more of an emphasis on the participation in or the connection with the community when it comes to mental health and not only to treating your inner world? Is that accurate? When you talk about treating outside of the office, that doesn't challenge any conceptions of patient-client privilege or whatever. That's a lawyer term. I don't know what you call it when it comes to confidentiality. Are there any confidentiality issues?
Yeah, of course. People defending those ideas, in which I would include myself partly, we don't propose to close the clinics. But instead of just funding clinics, we need to fund prevention and promotion. We don't know how to do it because we have been funding treatment and not funding prevention and promotion. That happens with a lot of things, you know. Many people would say that goes against freedom. For example, smoking and cancer. So many people would say, yeah, but if you do a lot of campaigns, you are violating my freedom to be a smoker. You know, like, yeah, but many people die. That costs a lot to society. And yeah, maybe we have to spend some money preventing people from starting smoking, especially kids. So the problem with mental health well-being, that is not just not smoking. It's like complex. And if you go deeper and deeper and deeper, you realize that you have to change society. Our society today has things in its very foundations that are not healthy. And the way that it would be obvious to change our society goes against the ideas of many. especially many that use the word freedom in a or liberty in a very, very different sense that I would do.
Right now, that's definitely a topic in the news when it comes to the reappropriation of language to further a particular political end. So when we're talking about that, when we're talking about the society we live in, the information that we consume, preventative health measures versus treating the symptoms, that seems to be a place where the conflicts of interest would definitely come in when it comes to, for example, in America, big pharma.
No, of course, because that would mean less sales for them.
This kind of comes back to what you were talking about earlier. With that in mind, also with the impact that social media has on people's mental health these days, and the isolation that it tends to produce, especially in young people. What do you do then? What do you do as a healthcare professional to try to instill in people a sense of control over their own lives or a sense of understanding and self-awareness when, in the end, the system is not something that you can break down in a day, right?
Yeah, it's not easy at all. I mean, prevention and promotion programs tend to be quite specific. So you have programs for bullying, programs for healthy habits, many different things. There are some that address different dimensions, especially designed for schools. Now there is also a lot for workplaces and so on. And there is also a lot of work done trying to address stigma. Stigma is a problem because it can promote well-being, and that's something you can do in schools, even in workplaces. But you're always going to have people that don't feel well. And if those people don't feel well, cannot speak about it, it's a problem. Another problem now after COVID is that it became a little bit fashionable to talk about your problems. TikTok, short videos about the new generation talking too much about their problems or saying that they take a lot of psychoactive drugs and whatever. We have gone, in some cases, and in a part of a generation, from being unable to talk about it to frivolizing it a little bit, talking so much about it and making it so cool, and we need something like a middle point, but it was not possible because, things happen or not happen. It's not so easy that things happen to a certain extent that is healthy. In any case, stigma for our generation is still very strong.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you, because different countries, that there are different levels of stigma when it comes to talking about mental health, but it seems to be also very generational. And now it's almost like it's cool to be ADHD, whereas before people didn't even know what that meant. You've worked a lot with this issue of stigma around mental health and seeking help. Have you felt like within the generation that isn't like the TikTok generation, has the stigma lessened over the past several years? Has COVID had anything to do with that? In Spain, do people feel comfortable talking about this, like people who are, say, 50 years old?
I would say yes, but it's still complicated, and it's still especially complicated in your workplace.
Part of the work that you've done has to do with self-care when it comes to healthcare workers specifically, right? And how their work impacts them. Nurses, doctors specifically. Also, mental health care workers, psychologists and psychiatrists. There's a cliche that the mental health care providers usually need it more than anyone else. How do you address self-care or well-being when it comes to a mental health care professional? How do you help support these people who support everyone else?
I mean, they don't need something so much different compared to the rest of the population. The problem is stigma when it comes to promotion. I mean, it is more or less easy to help someone that is just going to be a consulting psychiatrist, consulting clinical psychologist, so good level, but never boss, They are maybe willing to talk about their issues as long as there is privacy, but okay. But someone that wants to be the head of service, clinical boss, whatever, in the hierarchy, they don't usually want to talk about these things because that means showing weaknesses. And, if you're going to trust someone to be able to have all those responsibilities, you don't want someone weak, and you know what I mean, yeah?
Yeah, but isn't that kind of like people going to a Catholic priest for marriage counseling and the guy's never been married? Wouldn't it make more sense if someone's experienced these things and covered or dealt with them to be able to then have a better perspective on how he or she could help the patient?
Of course, but it doesn't happen. Still, we have a taboo with mental health when it comes to people that don't want to be exposed. They are ambitious and they want to have power. For a long time, we didn't want women in power because we thought they were weak. It didn't make any sense. Now we have female bosses and they are as effective as male bosses. It didn't have any scientific basis. It was just sexism. And then for a long time, we didn't want black people to be bosses, and when they don't have any problem being bosses. It was just racism. So now we have the same with people that have overcome these stressful situations, but they don't talk about it because they would think that some people would think they are weak. You cannot hide that you're a woman. Well, you can, but it's complicated. You cannot hide that you're black, but you can, for example, hide that you're gay. And we know that people has been hiding being gay for a long time. A gay boss is as effective as a heterosexual boss.
As you say, it's more difficult to hide your gender. It's almost impossible to hide your skin color. But the other factors that people believe could stand in the way of their advancement, such as your sexuality, such as political or religious beliefs, such as struggles with mental health, which those things are not all in the same category. But is there work being done when it comes to destigmatizing what companies seek in their leadership, for example? I know that there are programs in place when it comes to diversity and inclusion, not discriminating against someone for their sexuality, for example. But is there any studies at the European level or the Spanish level being done when it comes to inclusion, when it comes to mental health and leadership?
They're quite new. Canada, I think, was one of them. There is like a network of anti-stigma campaigns. The organization that is part of this network in the US is the Carter Foundation, Jimmy Carter Foundation. And we have here in Catalonia one, there is one in Madrid. There used to be one in the UK, in England. It was dismantled by Boris Johnson, but they still have in Scotland, Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, so a lot of English-speaking countries. And I think the first ones to do studies on this were the Canadians. It's from the government. They work direct. Some of these organizations are private, like Carter Foundation. Some are completely public. For example, the Canadian organization is part of the Ministry of Health.
What do you feel like is the most important thing right now that the mental health community should be focusing on in light of the way the world is? And is there something that you feel like, okay, this is also one area we really need to focus on and we're not?
I think we need to shift our focus, really. Of course, there are mental health problems that are prevalent after the pandemic. For example, eating disorders now here in Catalonia are going crazy.
Really?
Yeah, for example, that's a huge problem, and they are starting to train even primary care professionals because it's overwhelming. I'm not saying that that is not a problem, but we are still developing our work from a point of view that is completely decontextualized. I mean, my colleagues teach psychopathology, and then I teach psychological treatment, specific techniques for specific problems, and then we throw professionals out there in the world, and they don't connect this with social change, with what's going on in the world, with the political situation, the economic situation. Sometimes people is just poor, and poor people have problems, and you cannot treat the same way a rich person than a poor person because they are not in the same context, and they don't have the same opportunities, and they don't have the same risk and protective factors. But in research, we like put it as a covariate and so on in our stats, but we throw there out in the world professionals that don't make a difference if they are treating someone with specific problems that come from society as a whole, or they do it because they read something extra. It's not something that is in the basis of the profession. Some people do it, many people do it. I'm not saying that they don't do it, but they do it because they want to do it, because they have some extra training, continuous training after their studies, not because it's a basic part of their studies.
Are there any projects that you're working on now that you feel like are contributing to addressing this kind of issue?
Yes. We are ending one project which is called Citizenship as Mental Health. We work with a model that comes from Yale University in the US. It started as a model for working with homeless people that also had addictions, mental health problems, and legal problems. But then it developed, and there are different interventions, and especially the focus, the idea of how citizenship, which is your connection with rights, responsibilities, roles, relationships, and resources, it can be understood as your mental health, because mental health is not just the absence of mental disease, is being connected with your community, feeling that you belong to your community, being able to exercise your rights, having resources, having healthy relationships. And now we are training professionals in this model. It's like 8 hours, so it's not like a huge thing, but with the funding we have, we are doing what we can. And now we have been awarded a new project in which we are going to apply this directly with people with lived experience of mental health problems. We do have a website. Our research group, which is called First Person Mental Health Research Group. Also, there are many associations here in Spain.
Thank you very much for talking with us today, Francisco José. I love these kinds of conversations because I get the opportunity to learn from an insider's perspective about these fields that are so interesting, and not only interesting, but fundamental in the case of mental health and well-being. Without that, what do we have? So thank you, Francisco José, and your colleagues for doing such important work. If you or if anyone you know is struggling with addiction, with mental health issues, make sure you reach out to somebody, whether it's a family member, a mental health professional. There are resources out there. And if you live specifically within the Barcelona area and are looking for a list of resources in English, check check out the link in the description below. Barcelona.cat has a list of resources you can check out. Thank you for watching and listening. See you next month on the Metropolitan Culture Corner. And as always, if there's someone that you would like to see interviewed, please drop their name in the comments. Tell us who they are, tell us why we should interview them, or send us a DM. Okay, thank you, stay safe, and see you next month.